Thank you so much, Jay, for being a part of my project. Could you say a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm James Bevington. My specialization is sort of not having a specialization. I've studied agriculture, environmental sciences, space microbiology, and a few other things along the way. Currently live in Sydney, Australia, working as a consultant, and I have a startup.
Oh, that's amazing. So you're in Sydney right now.
Yeah,
On just a completely random kind of commonality thing. I actually have a friend from Australia that's coming this Saturday to visit me to go on a tour of the Johnson Space Center since they're having an open house then. So
oh, cool.
it's kind of.
Yeah, really cool.
So tell me about your startup.
Yeah, so we're the Interplanetary Exploration Institute, and I just this was coincidence. I planned this. I didn't plant this. Uh, our first coffee mug. So we build custom devices, any kind of lab equipment or payload to do science experiments in space. And our main project is actually trying to build a sensor that's going to fingerprint methane by its source type. So we'd be able to look at a plume of methane and say that came from, agricultural source, or it came from a fossil fuel source, or maybe it was, a natural source like a wetland or something like that.
And that's kind of interesting. I mean, I would expect for like methane to be methane to be methane, like CH4. But like, is it because of like the other things that are with it that you're detecting, um, based upon?
Yes. So we used isotopic fingerprints. So methane can have a carbon that's got extra neutrons, or can have a hydrogen that has extra neutrons. And based on the ratio of those extra neutrons and where they sit, you can start to differentiate the reaction that made the methane that you see.
Oh, that's kind of interesting. So like natural processes maybe have no preference to like the number of neutrons that you have, whereas like biological processes, there might be some type of carbon selection that happens in terms of, is that sort of the
Yeah, that's
theory?
exactly right. It's largely a function of its speed. So biology reactions occur really rapidly, and so they'll preferentially use the lighter isotopes over the heavy ones, or something that's really slow, like the production of a fossil fuel that occurred over millions of years, doesn't really preferentially select between heavy and light isotopes. So if you look at a plume of methane and it has very few isotopes, it's all light, the carbon-12 and the hydrogen-1, then it was most likely a biological product.
Okay, that's interesting. Wow. And what got you into that?
Yeah, I actually started kind of working backwards, to be honest. I was looking at unexplained sources of methane on Mars. So there's methane on Mars. We're not exactly sure what produced it. We're still sort of trying to understand the seasonal and temporal spatial patterns of this methane. And I thought, well, cool. How would one determine that, right? So, like, is there a measurement that we can make that just says, yeah, that this was produced by, this mechanism or that mechanism, or maybe it was biological? And so that's how I identified the isotopes. And then I went, all right, great. If I wanted to measure isotopes on Mars, how would I do it? And I'd build the sensor. And then I thought, okay, well, how am I going to get to Mars? Well, actually, we have this exact same problem here on Earth. Let's solve the Earth problem first. And then if we have, at that point, the technology and some cash flow, then we'll take the same payload, send it to Mars.
That makes sense. And you know, I mean, it's amazing how many kind of cross usage things there are in terms of things that would be useful here on Earth that you really need to go to space. It's like, why not go ahead and develop them now, get them used, and get some revenue from them, and then you're
Yeah,
ready
and
to
climate
go.
change is an urgent problem, right? Like methane is a big deal. 100 countries just signed an agreement roughly a year ago to reduce methane emissions by 30% by 2030. And I expect subsequent agreements, upcoming, that are going to continue to to lower the amount of methane emissions. So methane as a greenhouse gas is roughly 20 to 25 times more potent than carbon dioxide.
That's amazing. And like you look at projects like Starship that are going to be based upon liquid methane, and you wonder, wow, what will that have on um, climate and
Yeah,
methane in the atmosphere?
yeah,
Of course, if they try to like recapture some of the carbon, I yeah, but they'll be recapturing the CO2 and then turning that into methane, which potentially could be um, uh, bad, I suppose. Hmm. So you've had a lifelong interest in space. You were on the high rise, not high rise. Yeah, it is high seas. High seas is it.
it's easier.
High rise is the is the sensor on the Mars rover. But high seas. Do you remember a time before you were interested in space?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? When I was a kid, I was interested, and then space wasn't cool in high school and even in undergrad, right? And I got interested in other stuff, mountain biking, which I still do. In undergrad, I studied agriculture and environmental sciences. And it wasn't until I was in grad school that I really started thinking about space again. And that was kind of when it took off. And then it was, I had all these other interests and I went to space and then I started combining them. And that's when it really became interesting, right? So doing biology in space, using space to study environmental and agricultural problems, right, was kind of where I am now.
That's interesting. And I guess, do you remember as a child what got you interested in space? I mean, it's very common, I guess, for kids to be interested in space, but I just kind of wonder, where does that come from?
Yeah, I'm not really sure to be honest. My mother was always interested in the way that a normal sort of scientist interested citizen would be. I can remember Shannon Lucid setting a record for the longest woman in space, and my mother decided that we were going to celebrate by eating ice cream for breakfast. So I had these like little sort of subliminal, you know, plants all along the way. I don't think it was intentional. And to be fair, she's interested in a lot of scientific things that aren't space, but even now she'll, wake me up in the morning because there's going to be an eclipse or something that she wants to see and doesn't exactly know where in the sky to find it. She says, I'm going to wake up. Will you wake up with me to see it? Something like that.
That's amazing. Yeah, and you mentioned that space became not cool. Um, during I guess high school and undergrad and stuff. I I know that a lot of people lose their interest, but what would it have taken for you to maintain that interest? I mean, just to kind of think about how to get more space people out of the pipeline.
Yeah, I don't know. Um, in some ways, I don't think that it was necessarily a bad thing, right? Because now I have multiple interests that I can marry it with it, right? Like in a lot of ways, space needs to be solving other problems, like the main industrial focus of space, right? Communications, Earth observation, geolocation, right? Those are all around solving other problems, right? It's part of the value chain, right? We're taking photos of farms to help them understand how well their crops are growing, right? We're transporting data around the world to improve communications, right? And there's all just numerous applications like that. And so I think actually having an understanding of those applications, the end users, the problems that they face, and then sort of taking a space lens to try to solve those problems, that's actually the most valuable thing. Just being able to do orbital mechanics is like, okay, it's useful, but there's a lot of orbital mechanics problems to solve. Which is the right subset that's actually gonna like help somebody do a thing? And I think in a lot of ways that's actually really valuable. And so I think it was just important for me to kind of take my own course and figure it out and find, pursue all of the things that I find interesting. And even now, I have a lot of interests that aren't space. Maybe one day they come back and intersect. Who knows?
That is interesting. I mean, that's a very good point. That sometimes having an interest in something and then getting interested in something else and something else, it's a combination that really offers the
Yeah,
most value.
I mean, what was it like for you, right? Like, did you always love space? Were you interested in space throughout high school, or did you ever have any phase in your life where it sort of waned?
I um I had a lot of interest in space in high school, but I also had a lot of interest in computers and networking. And I graduated right as sort of the internet became like a public thing. I mean, I graduated from high school in 1994. I mean, that's the same year that Netscape went public, that Amazon went public. You know, um, it was the year where I I mean, it was beginning of the dot-com boom. Anybody who knew anything
Yeah,
about computers could get a job. It doesn't matter. I mean, if you could turn one on, you got a job. And because there was such a need for computer people. And you know, once you get a job in a field, you know, then getting the next one, the next one, the next one, you just kind of that just becomes your career. And you know, space really became a, a back interest. I mean, we watched with interest. I remember, I think in '97, um, when you know Node One and the
mm,
FGB got connected, and that was the beginning of the International Space Program. And I really think it's neat that now I'm actually working on that program. So it's kind of like kind of you know picking back up at that point. Um, but you know, I didn't. There went a decade or so where I really didn't give space that much thought because it really didn't seem like we were doing much in it. I mean, we had the Columbia disaster, and we had sort of like this push to go back to the moon, which kind of fizzled out. And then we had, um, you know, the time that really got really exciting again was whenever SpaceX started doing their
mm,
recovery of the first stage. And you're like, you know, this is something fundamentally different than what we've done. This is something that people first it's impossible, it's difficult, and basically lunch. That's like the
yeah,
what's happening. And then you know you had Starship, which originally was like the interplanetary transportation system. And I had gone down to Guadalajara. I think it was like what 2017, 2016, to actually watch Elon give that speech. And I brought my wife and my younger son because I was like, this is going to be historic. You know, you want to say that you're like here when this got announced.
you were there. Yeah, that's
Um,
cool.
yeah. And so, you know, now Starship is actually a thing and is actually did a test flight. And there's like, you know, a dozen of them, half a dozen of them built.
Yeah,
So it's like really exciting. I mean, I feel like, you know, now we're in like the age that people in 1960s thought the 1970s would be. So it's like
right.
kind of,
You know, it took a while.
yeah. And you know, it's just really crazy. I think once you have the first person like on Mars, people will be like, "Oh, well, it's possible." And then suddenly, I think we have a believability problem. And once you like break through that, I think the dam will burst, and it'd just be amazing to see what
Yeah.
happens in space. So, but talking about space, so I've been asking people, and it may seem like a silly question to ask you, but did you know that NASA's planning to send astronauts back to the moon?
I did, yeah. Yeah, I've been following that for a little while. Actually wrote a proposal about a month ago, maybe it's been 2 months now, to fly a payload on Artemis 3. So the lander coming down, it was a call for projects that would deploy some sort of instrument on the surface, and I contributed to a proposal for that. So very aware, and also like following it, you know, from an industry perspective, it's getting close now, right? They're asking for the small payloads. So that means they've got a lot of the bigger problems sort of figured out. Now we're getting to the details.
Um, and do most of your family and friends know that we're planning to send people back to the moon?
My mother definitely does, because I talk about it all the time. Um, Extended outside of that, I don't know, they're somewhere in the middle, right? Like I'm always surprised at how many people are unaware. But then I also sort of get it, right? There's so many things going on and there's so much other stuff, and like the news media doesn't put it front and center, right? So they don't it's not front and center for them, so they just don't really they're not really aware. They don't work in the industry, right? So there's probably a lot of other really exciting developments in other industries that I don't know about. And if they were to ask me like, "Oh, do you know about this thing in, whatever industry?" I would say no, and they go like, "How do you not know?"
Yeah, no, that's true. That's true. And especially now that we have such personalized news feeds, I mean, before you'd have to read the same newspaper and literally flip over the other articles that you weren't interested in. Now you don't even get the chance to flip over them. They just never ever appear for you.
Yeah, yeah, it's true.
Uh, so what was your reaction whenever you became convinced that we were serious about going back to the moon?
Yeah, it's been interesting, right? It's sort of ebbed and flowed over periods, and different people have put different spins on it. I'm all for going to the moon in a sustainable fashion. I think it's a good idea. I think one of the I don't want to say failures, but challenges of the Apollo era is that we really stretched to get there. And it was quite a geopolitical type of move. We planted our flags, we proved that we could do it, and then realized that we didn't really have the budget to stick around for very long. And what's different this time is we're building a more sustainable way. We're doing it with a realistic budget footprint. We're building a pipeline of things that's going to grow gradually over time, and I think that's much more sustainable long term than a handful of flights, plant some flags, and come home. So I think the more the narrative goes that way, the more excited I am. And when I see the narrative kind of peter off towards, now we're in a competition with, sometimes it's with China and sometimes it's with, between NASA and SpaceX, which I find silly because, they're sort of one and the same in a lot of ways. So, you know, I tend to take that like that narrative for me is yeah, frustrating at times because if we do go that way, then and that's the reason we're justifying going to the moon. We're going to go for a handful of times to see who goes first, and then that'll be that versus actually having a sustained presence doing good long-term science.
I mean, I look at like what is it? Dear Moon Project, sending those artists around the moon. I
Mm,
mean, if you like do that and it becomes like really economical to, like in the ballpark of like $1 million or $2 million to send people around the moon, I mean, it seems like that would be self-sustaining. There
yeah,
would be enough people who could spend that much money to go around the moon that would just do it.
yeah,
And then, adding surface trips just seems like an inevitable next step. It's like, well, for $2 million, you could go to the surface. $3 million,
how
you
cool would
could
that
bring
be?
home a moon rock. Yeah.
Yeah, to go to the surface of the moon.
Um, when you think about where all this might lead to, and you kind of like fast forward 200 years, what does it look like to you?
Yeah, I often think of space exploration as a bonus factor, right? There's if you the easiest comparison I can give is like your personal budget, right? You got to pay your bills. You have to put fuel in your car to be able to drive to work. These things are kind of non-negotiable. There are other ways to get to work, and maybe you can cost optimize those. But if you buy a car, you're not going to cost optimize that on a daily basis. You bought a car, that's kind of your mode, and that's like a medium term. But every once in a while, you're going to spend some money to go to the movies, or buy a board game, or do something like that, right? And the way that I think about it in a lot of ways is space exploration is that extra bit, right? Like if we do it today or tomorrow, it's not really going to change things that much, but we have to do it, right? Um, it keeps things interesting. It's something people want to do, and there's numerous versions of that, right? The Olympics is another one. The world would function without the Olympics, but it's still a really inspiring thing for humanity to do. It's one of my favorite things that humans do, right? We like stop, we put down all of our guns, and we go like play games and sports and compete in this like really healthy, much more productive social way. And so I think space is kind of, it gets its ups and downs, right? And the more we can solidify the other parts of what we do, right, and have peace, the more we can spend on doing things like exploration and Olympics and whatever else. And so I really hope that the next 200 years is us putting some of these conflicts behind us I think there'll always be conflict in the world, but if we can keep it to an absolute minimum, then that allows us to actually go do these cool things. And whether we, are on the moon with a sustained long-term, human presence, or Mars or somewhere else, to me, it's really just a function of like how well do we take care of Earth, how well do we take care of each other here, because that's really the first thing we have to do to be able to enable these sort of stretch goals.
Yeah, I keep thinking, what is the difference between like sports and space that drives the different levels of interest? And
Mm,
the one thing that kind of keeps coming to my mind is that with sports, you don't know who's going to win. You always could potentially have that upset. And like in space, we are purposely trying to take away every bit of unpredictability. And so it's like uh, there's like no room for kind of something unpredictable happening.
yeah, yeah, that's true. It makes sense. I guess there's a similar parallel with that. There was Mars One was trying to find a mission to Mars by making a reality TV show out of it, right? And those two things are quite fundamentally at odds with each other, right? You see a lot of reality TV shows pick the most dramatic, often unstable personality types so that there's drama and there's fighting and there's because that makes interesting TV. But your crew to Mars, like you want them to be the most boring group of people ever. They just get along. There's no fights. Like people often when they ask about high seas, right? So 8 months in isolation. There was six of us. We had very minimal contact with the outside world through a 40-minute communication delay. And people just assume that it was this drama filled like arguments and really tense like it is on reality shows. And it wasn't. Like, of course, there was a couple disagreements here and there, but like, it was overall, it would have been a really boring reality TV show. Um, and I think, yeah, if anybody trying to package and sell this would really struggle actually, because there just wasn't a whole lot there that they could pull from. And that's what you need for a successful mission.
It's true. It's true. But I guess, just thinking forward to like 200 years, do you see us actually having humans living like in space, like as part of their daily lives? Or do you think that it's going to take longer or happen
Well, I
much
mean, to
sooner than 200 years?
be
What are your
fair, we've
thoughts?
had a continual presence on space station for over 20 years now, I believe, or is it 25? I think it's 20. Might be
Well,
25 though.
so 2001, um, so October 31st, 2001 is whenever the first uh, crew was launched to
Yeah,
the International Space Station. So that's essentially, 22 years.
yeah. So if that's the definition of live, we're kind of already doing it. If it means high volume, longer term, but again, I think it all comes down to there's no reason we couldn't have, you know, colony on Mars in 200 years. Like there's no technical reason why. Humanity would just have to decide that's what we want to do, right? Like we do impressive things all the time. If that's what we wanted to do, we would do it. We'd figure it out. We'd build it. We go forth and do it. Unfortunately, we often spend our money and time figuring out how to shoot each other instead of doing productive things. And again, the less of that we can do, the more peace in the world, the more space that we get, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I guess in terms of like living in space, I'm thinking about, you have your wife and kids and husband, and you're just going about life. You don't think about, I'm off on an expedition working. Instead, you're like, I'm at home. I might take a side trip back to Earth, but I'll come back home. That's
Yeah,
kind of
look,
like my definition.
it also comes down to like the economic driver for it, right? Like you see these small towns that exist on the back of like oil or minerals or something, right? Like northern Canada, for example. There's these small towns that have popped up around oil, and they're there because the oil's there. And once you have enough people, right, you end up with a community. You have grocery stores and gas stations and schools and things like that because there's that driver there. But if the oil were to disappear overnight, those towns would probably fall apart really quickly. Um, and I think in a lot of ways, space is that. We have people in Antarctica, but they're on stations and they're on a mission, and they're there usually for science, and then they come home. And that's kind of more how we run space right now. And so if you have that economic driver to be in space, whatever it is, right? There's this really great manufacturing or there's a some sort of medical need to send patients to space, right? You can recover from injuries better, or whatever it is. Then all of a sudden you have a reason to have a workforce there, and then you get the sort of trickle down of that, right? The supporting bits. And so I think a lot of it is really what is that economic case, and does it make sense? And again, I think that's very much a function of, do we need resources? How much R&D do we do between now and 200 years to sort of develop the technology to use those resources?
Yeah, I mean, it's like cost benefit analysis, right? Like the exploration of the solar system, uh, the the benefits are unknown, but the cost is really, really high. Um,
Yeah,
and so the chances of actually finding something that would drive um, the exploration seems very, very unlikely at this point. But you bring down the cost, you do more of the exploration, then you find something, and then that could be the thing. So
yeah. I mean, the obvious one's minerals, right? A lot of talk about mining on the moon or mining on asteroids, and that could help support climate change mitigation here, right? One of the limiting factors of our ability to adapt to climate change is rare earth elements, and mining can be quite damaging to the environment here. So if you were to do that there instead of here, right, like there could be an argument for that. I think it's in the current state, it's far fetched, but in a future state, it might not be, right? 200 years from now, we'll have a totally different Earth, a totally different set of circumstances. It may make a lot of sense then to get to go do something like that. But human, like you see space, right? And most satellites are commercial satellites. They're paid for in private funding. They have a business model. They have investors. They have return on investment. Human spaceflight is still very much in the side of government, right? They're funding people to go do something that the government deems to be valuable. And when you make that shift, right, all of a sudden industry jumps in. Then that's when growth really happens. I don't imagine governments deciding to fund people to live in space, right, just to have the lifestyle. But industry very well could.
and then the people that just are wealthy enough and who really want to do it bad enough
Yeah,
could as well.
that's true.
So this may seem like a silly question, but if you could, would you take a trip to space?
Absolutely, in a heartbeat.
How far would you go? Would you go to the moon? Would you immigrate to Mars? Would you consider being on the first generation ship to another star system?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I didn't have a great answer before I started high seas. I have a good answer now. Um, at least for me to go, it's going to be on an exploration mission. It's not going to be to move there for the fun of it. And I think if you get to represent humanity on its first big step, say to Mars, um, that's something that's sort of bigger than yourself, right? Like I don't think you get to say no to that. Like if you're the human that's going to make that most successful, you should probably say yes, right? Like, of course, I have my own hopes and dreams of what my future looks like, and they're all Earth based. But I think if someone were to come to me and say, you're the one, we think you have the best mix of skills or whatever it is, then yeah, I think I'd have to say yes to that. I can't imagine myself saying no. I'd actually rather, have a farm or whatever it is, and not represent humanity on such a big path forward. But also, there's clear risks, and it wouldn't be the easiest thing to do either.
And that'd be amazing. Do you think at some point we actually make it to another star system?
Yeah, that's a tough question, right? I'd actually written a report about this for my master's. It's a really, really big undertaking, like more than 200 years. Um, in our project, we estimated that to get to a different star system, you would need, I think it was on the order of 500 years of research and development to build the spacecraft that would do it. And that's like a really long-term, sustained effort, and it would really need like some pretty serious motivation behind it. I can't imagine people doing that anytime soon. Like certainly not in my lifetime. It would take much, much more than my lifetime, like more than the entirety of, the US's history, right? Um, to just even build this spaceship, and you don't know whether it succeeds or fails, right? You may never know.
Well, and I think we're kind of constrained by the physics and our perception of the world as we understand it. Um, I mean, less than I guess what is it? About 100 years ago, Einstein came up with his theory about gravity, which predicted gravitational waves, which is a whole new fundamental concept of how space is constructed. And I keep thinking that as we take these steps outside of the Earth and start seeing the universe from different perspectives under different circumstances, maybe it will allow for us to see things that have always been in front of us in a new way, but have been invisible to us that might completely open up everything. Like, 1903 was the first time we had the first human powered, the first powered flight.
Yeah,
And now we have jets and rockets and ships. It's
yeah, it's
like,
pretty cool, isn't it? Yeah, it was just 120 years from flight. Now we're like we landed on the moon less than what is it, about 50 years after that, right? I mean, 60 years. Yeah, I guess 69. That would have been just under 70 years later. That's pretty impressive, right? The growth trajectory of technology. It's
yeah,
hard
and we've gone
to
from,
fathom, isn't it? Like it's hard to project out 200 years.
we've gone from nobody having computers to literally everybody having multiple computers in like, just a few decades. And
Yeah,
those computers being islands with like floppy drives
yeah,
to being like connected. Like, just
yeah. It's pretty
just
cool, isn't it?
amazing. Yeah, and I mean, used to I had to pay the city over. Now I could talk all the way in Sydney, Australia for essentially free.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Well, those were pretty much the questions I had. I see this as a time capsule for future generations, not even born yet, to kind of look back on what I think is going to be a historic decade, sort of like that first decade whenever we had the Wright brothers fly. Is there anything that you think would be worth adding, or did you have any questions for me?
No, I think we've covered it off pretty well. It's a really cool project. Glad to see you doing this, and yeah, looking forward to whatever future success that is. Even after we're gone, right? And somebody pulls this stuff up and says, "Oh, cool! This is like I imagine some PhD's thesis written about space flight perspectives and all those years ago or whatever it is. Be super cool."
I hope so. Well, also, if you know if anybody else that'd be willing to have a conversation, I hope you send them my way. I have like 400 and some odd more days to go.
Yeah, you got a bit, huh? Hopefully, there's no launch delays. You'll have to film more.
Oh, no, no, I am counting down to the end of 2024. That's always been the end,
Ah,
the
okay, okay,
the end. So
cool. All right, man. I will if I think of anybody, I'll let you know.
sounds good. Well, you have a good rest of your day then.
Yeah, you too. Take care.
Okay, bye bye.
Yeah.